have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hammond, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
All right, welcome back to Dr. J Radio Live with an exclusive interview with a leading investigative journalist from the UK, specifically in Bristol, who currently hosts a radio show and was in BBC. A very accomplished guy, and he's always up to date with the news, especially the news that you, the listener and the viewer of YouTube, do not get to hear on a normal basis. Tony, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Dr. J. I mean, in a way, I'm a sort of poacher turned gamekeeper, aren't I? Or maybe the other way around, gamekeeper turned poacher, having been in the belly of the beast at the BBC. But, I mean, I feel like I have had a very privileged time there, seeing how things are done and being involved in basically I was working at the BBC station for London, which had a pretty strong news team, and we got the first bite of the cherry of all the big stories in the city, really. As soon as anything popped up, we were there. We'd sometimes send 2 or 3 reporters to the scene of whatever was going on. Of course, most of news is just press releases churning out on the old fax machine as it used to be, or online. But we were also dealing with very real stories. There was an IRA bombing campaign going on at the time, so we were reporting on that too. And I think at that time, I was quite aware that there was a very, very strong kind of corporate push to get their version of events out in our news bulletins. And I immediately, I suppose, started to get my hackles up when I could see that going on.
Let me ask you this. Of course, a lot of people here who are truth seekers look at CNN, Fox News, and even BBC as the leaders in propaganda. Of course, the news that we're going to talk about is stuff that you don't see on BBC or CNN or Fox. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, you're right, of course. But things have changed quite a lot. The BBC, when I was there, was still actually producing some fantastic material, genuinely good. But I could see moving into jobs of managerial level, also editorial level, news editor level, quite a lot of what I would call kind of flesh creepy people. I mean, for example, in the early 1990s, you had Alan Frankovich. You might have come across. He's one of America's greatest documentary makers ever. He was making films with the BBC about Operation Gladio, for example, which was shown on BBC Two. Prime time, and these were films about NATO conducting terrorist attacks across Europe, and analysing that, interviewing people like Vincenzo Vinciguerra, who was the Italian fascist who'd been employed by NATO to blow up various places in Italy, including killing police officers, in order to create this strategy of tension and to direct the political and public attention towards the Red Brigades having done it, and the left wing. So the idea was that the Russians were funding terrorism within Italy. Well, of course, that wasn't happening at all. It was NATO who were then using the media and using their immense wealth to try and get these attacks blamed on. So this is the kind of stuff that the BBC was churning out in those days. And of course, slowly but surely, there's been as there has been in many of the networks across the world, in the Western world particularly, a dumbing down, really, and a corporate control coming. I mean, we're now in the situation at the BBC where you've got someone from the risk committee of HSBC as the BBC chairman. That's Rona Fairhead. So she's also working for HSBC, one of the banks that's the biggest money laundering banks in the world, that's been prosecuted several times. And in fact, she is even the subject of a private prosecution in the United States at the moment. So it's really the foxes have taken over the henhouse at the BBC now, but there is still quite a lot of good material, from the old days, like the Frankovich films, and the balance has gone now. I mean, there really isn't much balance at all. Although sometimes you do get good coverage of foreign affairs, domestic affairs here are appalling. I mean, basically, you may as well be, Cameron writing the script sometimes for the news bulletins, because the government has a pretty strong influence on how the news gets reported. Completely different to my day, actually. And I even have a friend of the family that worked in the BBC newsroom for a while as a temp, and she said that she was putting calls through the whole time to the news editor from Downing Street.
I'm glad you mentioned that there was a balance and the Fox taking over the hen's house in BBC, because between the three networks I mentioned, BBC, which broadcasts here in America, I think there's an American branch. Of course, they cover world news and, of course, American news, and CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all these other channels. But BBC seems to hit the nail more on the head than anything else. But again, we are still deprived of the best stories that they don't want us normal civilians to know, which is why we need investigative journalists like you to come forward. And I think now we are in a perfect place because we have the technology where people can, for instance, be on the streets of, say, the Gaza Strip and film something off their smartphone and immediately upload it to YouTube, and it'll go viral before the story is squashed. And that's the same thing with everything around the globe. And so in that case, I think we're much better off than we were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where the propaganda or the mainstream media was better off controlled. Would you agree?
Well, no, actually, because although there is the possibility, whenever I hear someone say, oh, this is going viral on Facebook, I'm afraid I get a bit suspicious that perhaps the NSA engines are churning away behind Facebook to make sure that particular story does go viral. Sometimes very important stuff hardly gets a look in. And we had a discussion on our radio show here in Bristol, actually, a two-way discussion between two of the best journalists in the west of England. One is the senior lecturer in journalism at the University of the West of England here in Bristol, and his name's Phil Chamberlain. He's just brought out a book which the initial publishers balked at, and he had to get another publisher, so it took him about 6 months to get the thing into print, about blacklisting, which is, basically the construction industry, but other industries, including things like nursing, running these big blacklists on union activists and stopping people get employment if they've raised issues of safety at work. So particularly if you're a contract worker or a temporary worker and you say, hang on, this machine isn't working properly and patients' lives are in danger, or are on a construction site, a similar type of thing, if you raise that, then they go onto the blacklist and they never get any work again. So Phil's pretty amazing guy. And against him, discussing on the other side of the coin, because Phil was batting for what you were saying, really, which is the internet and social media and YouTube being great places to do journalism. On the other side was Tim Tate, and Tim is the producer, director from Central Television. He was working for a while, I think, at actually Yorkshire Television, which was one of the ITV networks back in the 1980s. And then he was working for Discovery Channel. He's done a lot of work for Al Jazeera as a documentary producer. And Tim was saying the opposite. He was saying, well, actually, nowadays, the resources that we had in the 1980s and early 90s, I mean, he put together, for example, a $500,000 documentary for Discovery Channel called The Conspiracy of Silence, which looked at the paedophile gangs which were going on at a place called Boys Town, and also within the Republican Party, boys being trafficked, young boys for sex, up to Washington. He did his documentary. It cost $500,000. And he got paid for it, although actually Discovery Channel at the last minute decided they didn't want to show it. He still got paid. But he was saying, look, these are the sorts of resources you need to do a proper investigation into anything. And with just a laptop and maybe a microphone and a notepad, a camera, you just cannot do the forensic work that needs to be done to uncover corruption, to uncover massive fraud where people have gone to quite a lot of trouble and spent quite a lot of money covering it all up. that it really did take those big budgets and full-time barristers he had working for him, for example, working on legal stuff, going through legal papers, to make a really powerful documentary. And so, I mean, you can have a listen to the discussion for yourself, but I think Tim came up on top there. The other problem is that we've got, looking at the police side of investigation, is there's a lot of paralysis of that. We've got big cutbacks in the police, so when there's a big investigation that needs to be done, like what they call the VI paedophile scandal going on in London, Westminster and Whitehall at the moment, that the police are saying, well, we just simply haven't got the resources to do it. And you do need those sorts of resources in order to do proper investigative journalism that really does, when a documentary goes out on air, live, it really starts to shake the nation and get some real change.
Discovery shutting down the conspiracy of silence doesn't surprise me at all, because I've seen that happen several times throughout my lifetime, especially in the U.S. I think the UK just as well too. Another big thing you mentioned too was the NSA. I wanted to talk to you about Echelon. Do you know much about the Echelon base? Because I heard that that's the most advanced NSA base, and it happens to be located in the UK.
Well, it's not. I wouldn't call it Echelon base. Echelon is the old. It's a bit sort of. It's almost like you're talking about stuff from the 1990s there, because Echelon was this program which was supposed to go through all internet traffic, looking for keywords. It was part of what was called UCUSA, which is the UK-USA agreement. Intelligence sharing agreement, which was outed, I think it was by Duncan Campbell, the investigative journalist over here in the 1980s and 90s. But I think the base you're talking about is Menwith Hill. This is up in North Yorkshire. It's right on a lonely moor. These 10 or so what we call golf balls on the hills, and it's surrounded by barbed wire. There's a protest there every Tuesday with various people, including Lindis Percy, who runs a little outfit called CAB, which is the Campaign for Accountability of American Bases in Britain. And that's where massive amounts of data are sent up to satellites. Satellites are scanned. So in other words, when a phone call or internet traffic is going via satellite, so Menwith Hill is keeping an eye on it. But what Duncan Campbell discovered is that, and he did a brilliant article in The Intercept recently. If people haven't come across him, he did an article called My Life Uncovering the Crimes of the Signals Intelligence Agencies. What he discovered was that there actually was that the golf balls, in a way, are a bit of a diversion, because they cover over satellite dishes which are pointing up at the sky, and the reason there's a golf ball around it, apart from to protect it from the weather, is so that nobody with a camera or any kind of equipment can see which part of the sky they're scanning. He discovered trunking going through ground cables too, straight into the British telecoms network, and so he realized that once they brought in the digital telephone exchanges in the 1980s, that effectively the US could listen into any phone line, which includes, of course, listening into rooms where telephones are actually on the hook, and that was quite a revelation in the 1980s.
David Petraeus, the former head of the CIA, who was, I don't know if he was a 5-star general or a very high general in the United States Army, stated in 2007 that we, meaning the United States or all the global counterintelligence or intelligence communities, have the capability of turning on your PC camera and microphone as well as your smartphone camera and microphone without you even knowing it. And that just goes to show that we have a lack of privacy. Each time I visited the UK, I was blown away at the amount of CCTV cameras that I saw, and from what I hear, and can correct me if I'm wrong, they've increased to an exponential rate where you can't turn a single corner or do anything on the street without being viewed.
Well, that's not quite true. Certainly city centres are like that. Often housing estates or particular housing schemes will have CCTV in them. But, I mean, you're right about that. We've got, I believe, more per square foot of road space than anywhere else in the world. And you know what? I in a way, feel almost proud of that. I mean, this is Orwellian, isn't it? You've got George Orwell. A lot of people in Britain have read Orwell and are still reading Orwell. A lot of the young people are reading Orwell. And I think it's because the authorities are so afraid that the youngsters are so much aware of this big brother state that they are having to keep their eyes on everything. There's been some real victories, actually, in certain parts of the country where, for example, one of the Islamic districts of Birmingham, mainly Islamic people living there, a whole massive CCTV system was installed, and then some campaigners in Birmingham decided to challenge it through the courts and through the local authority, and the whole lot was taken down. So there have been some victories, but yeah, CCTV. If you go, the other thing, of course, I don't know if you or your listeners have ever seen it, but the program, the drama, which was made in 1969 here in Britain by ITC, called The Prisoner. That was a fascinating, I think, very entertaining, cynical look at the future from a kind of Orwellian point of view. I mean, it was based on a real place in Scotland where World War II spies who had got a little bit over freaked out or wanted to, or that the authorities were worried that they might sort of go down the local pub and start spilling the beans about top secret stuff, were sent there to, shall we say, cool down, and it was although they were advised to go there, wasn't really any choice. And also, once they were there, they couldn't leave, even though they were our people, until the authorities had decided they could. So this program was made in the 1960s as a kind of modern version of this. So the main protagonist in it who's called hello. The main protagonist in it, he is taken to this village, and the whole series really is about him trying to leave it and trying to get out, and the authorities trying to trick him into trusting people within the village and get information out of him. So that's the sort of thing that we've been brought up here on in the UK. So I think any kind of Big Brother society that's coming now or in the future, I mean, our culture is very much prepared for it.
A lot of people talk about the New World Order. Of course, there's the European Union. There was talks about they were trying to form an African Union. Of course, there's the American Union, which is supposedly calling the shots for Canada and Latin America. And then, of course, we have what's to be formed, the Asian Communion. But if we have all this being done, then what would we do to protect ourselves? I mean, do you believe a one world government is the right way to go, or independent countries? I believe we're over 200 countries at this time, each with their own heads of state, independent laws, different from each other. I think that's the better way to go, as opposed to having a one world government. What are your thoughts about it?
Well, good question. And I mean, this. Look, Dr. J, this is this. I'm interested in justice. I'm interested in people who have freedom, and I don't think any kind of one world government is going to bring us that. I mean, all it does is it makes it easier for us to be controlled. I mean, there have actually been some good stuff going on at the United Nations, which is, I suppose, a kind of precursor. Some people see it as that kind of one world government. Effectively, we've got a one world government in the West. What we've got in the transatlantic, in Europe and in the United States, is very powerful corporations that basically write the laws. I mean, there isn't really any input anymore from ordinary people into writing new laws. And you've got a European Union which is very overtly run by corporations. It's run by something called the European Round Table of Industrialists, and sitting around that table there are US corporations and European corporations. And actually, many of those corporations, you're scratching your head to think, well, actually, which side of the Atlantic is this corporation based? Because they've got massive operations on both sides of the Atlantic. So these are the guys who are in the driving seat, and And the people who are running them are the banks and the bankers and the banking regulators and the Swiss, people like UBS, these massive banks in Switzerland, and the Bank for International Settlements that does the global banking regulation, which we never hear about on the TV news nowadays at all. BIS in Basel, it is where Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, was on some of the top committees there. They are the banking regulators for the world, and they are responsible for the deregulation that led to the 2008 crash, that's led to massive fraud going on. For example, as I mentioned earlier, with HSBC, they're laundering money for the Mexican drug cartels. The HSB actually adapting their branches in Mexico to allow for suitcases full of cash to come in. Now don't tell me that that's a regulated bank, because it isn't. And this is the people who are really responsible for this are in Switzerland, in the BIS in Basel. And this is the bank which was set up after World War One to administer war reparations for the First World War. And then at the end of the Second World War, John Maynard Keynes and others ordered it through a vote at the Bretton Woods conference to be closed down, because this is where the Nazis are beginning all their foreign exchange from. They'd also been funding the Nazi Party, the arms in late 1930s Germany through the BIS. So it's effectively, one of the banks that put Hitler into power. Is regulating the whole banking system, and it gets very, very little scrutiny. Its nickname is the Tower of Basel. And it's a brilliant book if your listeners haven't come across it before. Well worth it. An entertaining, great writer, English guy actually, who lives in Hungary now, called Adam Labor, wrote this book, The Tower of Basel, all about this bank, which is really at the heart. It's kind of the spider at the center of the web of the economic crisis.
I'm so glad you brought up the banking system, because obviously there's a lot of corruption. They control virtually everything. They can wipe out the middle class and keep the rich super rich and keep the poor very poor. My family came here as poor immigrants from Greece, and they came to America with the American dream, and they thrived. But now they're being squeezed to death with all the taxes. I want to go back in history. After World War I, prior to World War II, George W. Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, was, I believe, president or higher up in the Chase Manhattan Bank, of course, in New York, and he was alleged to have funded both sides of the war. Same with the UK. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I'm not all that good on the funding, but I know there's a great book or set of books by Anthony Sutton about the Wall Street and the rise of Hitler, also Wall Street and the rise of Bolshevism. But I think the London was definitely involved as well. I mean, you had Montague Norman at the Bank of England, who was, in many of his statements, were pro-Nazi. And there's some good old document. I think there's even a Horizon documentary from the BBC again in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s about some of these characters who were trying to sort of play both sides in the Second World War. But I think the more interesting side of it, which we really need to get our heads around right now, is the amazing disappearance or death, if you want, of this Hitler's treasurer, Martin Bormann. Now, Hitler worked, as many dictators do, by having various or several people, usually 2 or 3 people, all doing a very similar job, so that each one would be trying to sort of vie with the others to be their favourite, and be the one who was most likely to be promoted. And in that it was the Gauleiter role, who was looking after the funds and controlling access to Hitler, was this guy Martin Bormann. Up until 1941. Rudolf Hess had been in a similar role, but what happened was he was sent over to Britain on this kind of crazy mission to try and persuade the British to come in with the Nazis to attack Russia. And of course, the end result of it was that the British decided, no, we don't want to do that, old chap, and Hess was then interred. But this left Bormann as really having complete control of Hitler, so he controlled all access to him. And the other thing he was doing was he was basically running all these bank accounts, all the looted cash, art treasures, securities, share certificates, all these kinds of things from Europe, and he was squirreling them away, mostly to begin with in Berlin, but then towards the end of the war, when they realised they were going to lose, there was this very important meeting that took place in Strasbourg at called the Red House meeting in August 1944, where basically the German industrialists got together. It was organised by Bormann, and said, well, look, we are going to lose this war, but we've got ourselves probably a year or 6 months to get our wealth into secret places so that we can resume after World War II, and that's what happened. Bormann was in charge of all that. He was supposed to have died at the end of the war near the bunker with Hitler, but the body that was produced clearly from the DNA and other evidence showed that he died quite a long time after the war. So it wasn't Bormann. So what happened to him? Well, anyway, there's a lot of evidence now, particularly through the testimony of a guy who's in the Royal Marines called John Ainsworth Davis, writing under a pen name of Christopher Crichton, because he was quite rightly worried that he'd be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act, because he didn't want to write a fiction book like Ian Fleming was good at writing fiction books based on wartime stuff, the Bond novels, because he knew that he could write fiction and no one could do him for under the Official Secrets Act. But John Ainsworth Davis had a different attitude. He said, no, I want to write the story as it happened to me, as a factual book. So he had to write it under this pen name, Christopher Crichton. And it's pretty clear now, from the evidence I've been putting together here, that there was a mission, literally in the last week of the war, of British commandos into Berlin to get Martin Bormann out and bring him back to Britain, because he held the keys to vast amounts of wealth. It might not sound a lot now, but you're talking around about £1 billion worth of wealth, including gold and stuff in Switzerland. So that's what it certainly looks now. If you read that book, you'll see that what that operation was about. It's called OpJB by Christopher Crichton, and the OpJB is short for Operation James Bond. The reason he uses that name is because that was, according to Crichton, according to John Ainsworth Davis, that was the original name of the mission to snatch Bormann. And I found it amazing that if you look in the people who are actually running that mission, who do you find? Ian Fleming, Naval Intelligence. And so I think what was going on with the James Bond novels that Fleming was writing after the war is he was kind of giving us a bit of a hint, a little clue as to something interesting that had been going on during World War II. So anyway, the evidence is there for this operation. Certainly the people that I've spoken to who knew him, etc., and also the evidence in the book is pretty clear something was going on there. But I think probably the more, in a way, more important side of this is what happened after Bormann came back to Britain. It looks like quite possibly some of the Nazi loot was used to fund the British atomic bomb project. There's a terrific book written by one of the great scientific advisors to Churchill, who was in on all of the top meetings right the way through at the cabinet, the war cabinet through the Second World War. R.V. Jones wrote a book called Most Secret War, which talks about the sort of struggle that there'd been over the bomb, the atomic bomb. Churchill was really worried that the Nazis had been developing an atomic bomb, and when the V2s rockets started landing on London, it was quite clear to everybody around that if they did have an atomic bomb, they could stick one on these V2s and literally nuke London. And in 1944 and 1945, this was a major worry for the War Cabinet, and R.V. Jones talks about it. They were basically biting their nails, not knowing if this was going to happen. So it was quite clear that towards the end of the war that the atomic bomb was going to be the big prize, and they were very annoyed, mightily annoyed, when it looks like the Americans had, beaten the British to it, and with the Manhattan Project. So there was a big effort, I think, in London to make sure that the British atomic bomb happened, and it did in 1952. And when Churchill announced it in Parliament, there was a gasp of amazement, because only one or two MPs even knew that there was any kind of a British atomic bomb project going on. But 52 is an interesting year, because that's when Martin Bormann apparently appears in South America, in Buenos Aires, And this is documented by one of your own top journalists from the war. His name's Paul Manning. Paul's was working for CBS during the war, and he was doing reports from the European war and beaming these reports back to the United States for CBS. So anybody of that age would have remembered, from 1943, 2, 3, 4, 5. We remember Paul Manning's voice as one of the voices of the war, hearing what was going on in Europe day after day. Did things like, for example, he went on to bombing missions with American pilots, daytime bombing missions mostly. So he was then, even doing some recording up in the aircraft, for example, and he was going on with the ground troops. So Manning was someone who knew the war intimately, was with the fighting men right the way through, really, in Europe. And he wrote a book in 1981 called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. It was really what he felt was his swan song. And that book goes into detail about Bormann, evidence that he was in South America, and he was basically a bureaucrat, and he was using this wealth. A lot of it was laundered through the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm in New York, which was the Dulles Brothers law firm, and that money was then invested in 750 corporations. Bormann was a bureaucrat. He was creating these, writing to Companies House here in London, and creating businesses. And what he was doing was he was investing this laundered cash into these businesses, and then he was taking Nazis in the 1950s who'd obviously taken off their uniform swastikas and put on nice suits and marched into the boardroom to run these businesses. So we don't know for sure now which businesses were set up originally by Bormann and where that money went, but certainly the evidence presented by Paul Manning in Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, this hardly known book, which really documents the other side of what happened to the Nazi loot, is pretty powerful stuff. And, for me, it's an important bit of investigative journalism, because this question of what happened to the loot, the looted wealth of Europe that the Nazis gathered between 1939, 1938 actually, and 1945, has finally, for me, been answered. It's a question I've been trying to answer for many years, and the work of the British journalist Lawrence de Mello in Buenos Aires has also been really important in bringing some of this to light.
I'm so glad you brought up the Nazi loot. They had art, of course. They had gold, which they smeltered down into, I don't know if it was kilos or pounds, probably kilos, bricks. I mean, they were just stacked. They went as far as taking people's gold teeth. And I wouldn't be surprised if, obviously, like you said, 750 corporations were set up. We don't know if the Third Reich, or should we say Fourth Reich, continued to carry on. As you said, Bormann was not found when the Russians invaded the bunker where Hitler was supposedly dead. And when they did the analysis of Hitler's body, it was shown, according to Peter Levende, to be not be Hitler. The DNA, I don't know about the DNA, but they said that the skeleton was actually a female. The height was a little bit different, and all the world leaders, the most famous world leaders, most of them have body doubles. Who's to say that Hitler didn't have a body double? And even the FBI's own files here in America tracked or had sightings of Hitler in South America. In the late 40s, early 50s.
I mean, Lawrence pointed it out to me when I first spoke to her. She said, well, Klaus Barbie was over here. You had Joseph Mengele over in South America. There was a whole list of, you can just look it up on your favorite search engine, how many Nazis popped up in South America at the end of the war. And you're telling me the money man wasn't there? Now, come on.
That's right.
Of course he was there, and they were very busy. And of course, what this really means is that what Vincenzo Vinciguerra, this Italian fascist guy who's in jail talking to Alan Frankovich, said is absolutely right. In 1945, Vinciguerra says, World War II ended and World War III began. Because there was a game basically that was being played. Recently came out that this thing, Operation Unthinkable, that Winston Churchill was actually planning to nuke Moscow at the end of the Second World War. He didn't he wasn't wasting time in pursuing his goal. And I think ever since the days of Napoleon, it seems that there's been attempts by the Europeans to attack Russia. It's going on right this minute still. But what we're dealing with now is a different kind of war-fighting force. In the Second World War, it's very obvious. You're talking about, your Tiger tanks, Panzer tanks, your Stuka dive bombers, and this kind of thing. Nowadays, it's corporations. It's the corporation that will come in with a hostile takeover. It's the financial system behind it. It's the whole financial network, which is basically now, ever since the Blue Arrow trial in the City of London in 1992, has impunity. Any kind of dodgy dealing that goes on, if you can get away with it, you can do it. That's become the City of London's unique selling point. So you've got an army of bureaucrats, financial people, and gigantic corporations that control and monopolize all the things we basically need, like food, etc., through the supermarket system. Big companies like Cargill controlling these things, the big pharma, that these people can basically shut you down, can completely take you over, monopolize markets, etc. And that's every bit as effective as coming in with a tank. They're just taking over with money now.
I'm exactly. You really hit the point that I was trying to get at. Is yes, World War II, you had blood and guts, bombings, guns, bullets, everything. That you said, the Panzer tanks, the Normandy invasion. But what's the best way to control the public 50 years, 60, 70 years down the line? Via financially. And that's what I believe is why the Third Reich never really ended, or should we say the Fourth Reich began, because Berlin is really calling a lot of the shots with regards to finances. They almost bankrupt Greece, almost took over a lot of the islands that have been owned by Greece for several thousand years.
That's right. I mean, they are very powerful, Berlin. But there are still differences between the US and Europe. It's been really interesting to see, particularly to do with the Syria policy, where I wrote something the other day about this, saying, well, actually, is this Merkel's finest hour? Kind of coining the phrase from Churchill, talking about the Battle of Britain in their finest hour. These Spitfire pilots stopping the German bombers coming over to prepare for an invasion of Britain in 1939, because it was really interesting to see the way that Merkel stood up to pressure from Kerry and from the US to condone this whole concept of regime change in Syria at the United Nations a few weeks ago. So that was an interesting moment to see the Germans say, actually, no, we value trade with Russia more than regime change in Syria. And she didn't quite put two fingers up to the US, but it was interesting that the same week we had this Volkswagen scandal with 70, I don't know what it is now, but I mean, even just within a few weeks, it has 70 billion wiped off the value of Volkswagen cars, with fines of $40,000, I think it is, per car sold in the US or missold in the US, which is, devastating, the heart of the German industrial sector. But it looks like that Merkel and the Germans are prepared to take that for not supporting what was going on in Syria. I mean, there's been very little, I think, connection between these two things: the Germans refusing to support regime change in Syria, and the Volkswagen scandal in the mainstream media. But to me, it seems obvious this is geopolitics at work. I think the US regulators have known about the problems with software in the German cars for a long time, but they've just been waiting for their moment to use it as a kind of card on the geopolitical chessboard.
I'm so glad you brought up Syria and the geopolitical system and problems at that. $40,000 fine per car for a Volkswagen is actually a loss, because you can find a brand new VW here in the United States for under $40,000. So they're literally operating at a full loss. But for them, the chancellor or the prime minister to actually accept it and to take that loss as if nothing major has happened goes to show that there's so much more money hidden there. Now let's talk a little bit more about Syria there. That is a brewing ground that's about to explode. You have Russia coming in there with anti-aircraft, tanks and things that would not shoot down the rebellious troops, but more to shoot down American F-18s and other stuff like that. What do you think is, in speculation, is going to happen and is happening that we, especially in America, who's deaf, dumb, and blind with regards to the mainstream media, that we're not being shown, because everything's being shown as pro-USA, but whenever USA is faulted at something, we're not shown that. We have to look outside to find this source. I have to go to people like you and talk to other international journalists or investigative journalists to find out the real information and to piece it all together. But nonetheless, we here in the United States are not being told the truth with very many things, and it's been proven time and time again that that's a fact, that we are being lied to. And so what do you think is happening with Syria and the funding with Syria and with Russia now entering the game, and now just recently Obama saying he's going to send over some troops?
Well, look, Russia's been in the game for many years. The Soviet Union years right the way through to the Putin era. And, look, Dr. J, I've got to laugh about this, actually, because when we were kids at school, I'm talking about sort of 18, 17 years old, chatting about world affairs as young boys usually tend to think that they can change things for the better, or at least they can get their head around. We used to joke about, oh, gosh, the Golan Heights, that looks like that's where World War III is going to kick off, and that's back in, what would that be, 1978 or something, because Syria has always been right on the pivot of what's going on between the East and West. And in those days, it was the Cold War. As a Russian place that the Americans and the British and NATO had their hearts set on, even back in those days. Certainly in those days, it was more to do with trying to grab oil or control oil supplies. But then once I think it was the '67 war, wasn't it, when Syria lost the Golan Heights to the Israelis, that became a very obvious sort of flashpoint, and so in a way it doesn't surprise me that Syria is now right in the crosshairs, the same in a similar way to Ukraine. But I think if you want to know what's going on there, I think you've got this whole business, haven't you, of the project for the new American century, and this whole idea of a new Pearl Harbor, which many people look upon as 9/11 in order to accelerate American expansionism after the turn of the century in the 21st century. So you've got that Wesley Clark statement, which was made about seeing this plan just at the time of the 9/11 attacks to take over 7 countries in 5 years. Well, there's a few things to say about that. Obviously, Syria and Iran are on that list. But the other thing is they're way behind schedule. And this means that the other side, should we say the Chinese and the Russians mainly, of course, in global power, know exactly what they're up to. There's only one way that you can do these sorts of long-term plans, and that's to keep quiet about them. And it seems that they're leaking like a sieve what they're intending to do. So the Russians and the Chinese have had a long, long time to prepare for what is going on, and quite clearly they're not going to allow this takeover of the Middle East that the US wants. Now, look, I mean, what happened in Libya was appalling, and we got lied to massively at the TV here about how terrible the Gaddafi regime was. Of course, it was actually providing the best living conditions of any country in the whole of Africa. They were doing things like they had the lowest infant mortality rate. They had a brilliant social system where every single person in Libya had a home, and if they didn't have a home, they would get a free home. Amazing system for housing people, not like here in Britain or in the US, where you've got loads of sort of poor homeless people living in tents in the parks we have here now. I'm sure you've got a similar kind of thing. You wouldn't have that in Libya. But you see, the trouble with Libya was it was in the wrong place. And even if Gaddafi had gone cap in hand to Moscow, to Putin, to say, well, look, or to Beijing to say, we want a bit of protection, I mean, they're looking at it strategically and saying, well, you're the wrong side of Egypt. You know, how on earth are we going to protect you? We haven't got a base on, you're not giving us a base on the Mediterranean. And that's effectively why Syria is in the position it is, because it's had a long-term agreement with the Russians, and it's also in a strategically defendable space. So, you know, you've had missiles coming across from the Caspian, haven't you, for example, as well, to hit ISIS in Syria. So I think that's really effectively what's going on here. It's just something that's been playing out for many, many years. We're in quite a dangerous phase, I think, at the moment, because, you know, I'm afraid I look quite cynically at the transatlantic elite as a kind of medieval style empire where they want to go out grabbing territory constantly. They're not prepared to let the world rest and live in peace, for people to sort of just get on with their lives. They want a constant expansionism. They're only happy when they're expanding their resource bases, you know, whether that's oil, whatever, territory. A bit like medieval days when, you know, sort of in the springtime, the medieval barons, dukes, whatever, you would ride out and go and get some booty, and that was basically what they lived for. And it's similar. We've got a similar sort of situation now. But what's happened is the NATO empire, if you want, has come up against a brick wall, both in Ukraine and in Syria. And one of the things that bothers me is when they come up against a brick wall and they don't think they can expand anymore, they tend to go for these cataclysmic events like 9/11. That's what bothers me, is that we're in a sort of situation now where they've been blocked and blocked. I mean, in a way, Putin's done an amazing kind of judo throw by allowing the US-sponsored ISIS people, you know, a lot of them have come from Guantanamo, not Guantanamo, from these prison camps, these black prison camps where people are kind of disappeared, and you know they're completely out of any kind of legal jurisdiction to become these ISIS fanatics. That we're in a situation where the whole of the West is in a, you know, any time now there could be another one of these kind of false flag events or some kind of media shock, cataclysmic event in order to justify another kind of extension of this project, because basically they've been blocked and they have very little other options. Now, when I talk about them, I mean, a lot of people say, well, who are they? I think we need to look at what went on in Italy, actually, in the P2 scandal in Italy, because there was a lot of CIA influence on that. And, of course, the intelligence services are running the show effectively here alongside the banksters, the Securocrats, is that they run things but with these kind of secret committees, basically. The P2 Masonic Lodge in Italy was running Italy. It was the effective government. It was a shadow government, a parallel government, but much more powerful than the real government, because they ended up killing Aldo Moro, the former prime minister, you know, who was trying to cut a deal with the communists. So they were basically police officers, media owners, army officers, all sorts of bankers, powerful people that just used to meet him, based around Licio Gelli. He was a fascist in the Second World War. And the effective way of running Italy was behind the scenes. I think exactly the same sort of thing is going on in the US, exactly the same sort of things going on in Europe and in the UK, where you've got secret committees of powerful people who get together in secret to decide our fate. And it's not democracy, whatever it is.
I'm so glad you brought up. There's so many points that I wanted to comment on before I ask you this question about these false flags. First of all, let's not forget, for all those people listening and seeing this after on YouTube, Putin was a high-ranking member of the KGB, and he's done a brilliant scheme to remain in power. First he was president, then became prime minister, then president again, or vice versa. That way he could keep his power flowing. And then, of course, he's got this billion-dollar resort in the Black Sea. And he's obviously, him and China have this alliance that are definitely showing America that what we're doing here, playing the world police, is A, wrong, and B, that they may be the next threat, per se. Also, with regards to Gaddafi, I heard that one of the reasons that the problem with Libya started was because Gaddafi wanted to get off the U.S. Dollar standard with regards to oil and use the African gold coin. And then, of course, he was executed. And like you said...
Well, that's right. I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but if you look up the African gold dinar online, you'll find that he was quite advanced in his program to create this new currency, really, to help free Africa from the grip of the IMF.
Yes. And I agree with you on a very major point. Gaddafi kept the people in Libya in a much safer state. Yes, there's a lot of bad news about him and a lot of bad reputation with him being an evil dictator, but the people living under his regime are living far better times than they are now. And I hate to say this too, but even Saddam Hussein, now the United States has come there. We bombed the heck out of that country, and there's still wars going on. But when Saddam was running it, it was more in line. He kept his people in line. Maybe the people in the Middle East want that sort of dictator or leader versus democracy. You know, who's to say that the United States should step into any country and say this is the way it needs to be done? No,
well, of course they shouldn't. No, I mean, it was worth remembering Gaddafi came to power in a bloodless coup. He was colonel. He took over the country and basically arrested loads of the corrupt politicians who'd been there and the king. And he said, look, hey guys, I really don't want to shoot you, but if you go and get on that plane over there, you can go off to Europe and we'll forget about it, And that was actually a pretty mature way to do a coup, without shooting people. And the idea was, look, I haven't got anything against these people. I don't want to create bad blood, but let's just, let's have a new regime which is built on, kind of forgiveness and a bit of kindness rather than something else. So it's an amazing thing that many people forget about Gaddafi. I mean, I think he was a bit potty. I think people that running countries generally, I don't know, it's very difficult to find anyone that's not a gangster running a country. But there was also the propaganda we had here in Britain was immense, really. I mean, as an investigative journalist myself, looking at we actually even had two major documentaries shown on British television, which proved that the two major reasons why Gaddafi was supposed to be such an evil guy were just lies. We had the murder of PC Yvonne Fletcher outside the Libyan embassy in the 1980s. There was a brilliant documentary about that called Murder in St James that showed that she couldn't possibly have been shot from the Libyan embassy, that actually she was shot from just looking at the trajectory of the angle of the bullet went through her body that killed her. It came from another part of the square, from the very top of a building, which, hey-ho, was being hired to Britain's security services. So she was almost certainly killed by one of our own people, or possibly someone from the CIA, no one's really sure. And then the whole thing was blamed on Gaddafi. So the murder of PC Yvonne Fletcher in the heart of London, and also, of course, the Lockerbie bombing, Pan Am Flight 103, also in the 1980s, was very much blamed over the years on the Libyans, whereas Alan Frankovich, we're coming back to the great American documentary man. Well, actually, I think he was Peruvian originally, but he went to LA Film School and he made some of the best documentaries you'll ever see, eye-popping stuff. And Alan's documentary was called The Maltese Double Cross, and it really did explode the myth that this Pan Am bombing had anything to do with Libya or Gaddafi. It just proved that there was complete nonsense, and that there were CIA people crawling all over the crime scene almost before the aircraft had come down. So that just shows you what the media is generally used for, which is just to throw a complete smokescreen out for hideous illegal acts and to blame somebody else for something where effectively we're always hearing on the news, aren't we, on CNN, oh, such and such, Gaddafi, it was one of the latest ones, Assad, of course, as well, are killing their own people. Well, what's going on is our own intelligence services, aligned with our military-industrial complex, the arms companies, mercenary groups, private military companies like Blackwater, etc., are killing us, and that's what's going on.
That's it.
Blackwater, incidentally, it's funny, but I know they're called XE now or something, aren't they? Or maybe they've changed their name again since. They change it every 5 minutes because it's such a awful organisation, and they need to kind of have a complete makeover every 5 minutes. But Blackwater, because it's thought of as a US firm, Eric Prince running it. Hang on a minute, Blackwater is just literally a stone's throw away from the Royal Sandhurst Military College here in sunny England. So I wonder whether Blackwater. So it's actually quite a nice little kind of little town, little kind of village almost. But I think there's more British enthusiasm and expertise involved in Blackwater, possibly even than many people know.
When the world's governments have to use private military contractors as opposed to their own military, obviously something's afoot. They're doing something that's not against or not within the rules of engagement, or they're, of course, starting wars, such as a former friend who served in Vietnam as a Navy SEAL told me that every directive he had came from the Central Intelligence Agency. I've also recently spoken to a former DIA operative, Defense Intelligence operative, and it's the same thing, that they are there just basically to start wars and to fund black operations. Now, back to the 9/11 and false flags. Prior to 9/11 actually happening, President George W. Bush said something to the effect of, we need a new Pearl Harbor to rally everybody together against a cause. And when you look at the footage from that's shot from several angles of what actually happened here in New York on September 11, 2001, you can see, first of all, the building owner of Building 7 gave an interview that day and said that he had to pull it, in demolition terms, meaning demolish the building. Are you to tell me that within a terrorist attack, amidst a terrorist attack, they're able to gather all the demolitions supplies, wire them up, survey the building, and then detonate it in a matter of hours? It just doesn't seem right unless they've been planning it for weeks. And not to mention that housed some of the most secure documents that to this day that they claim were destroyed in the 9/11 attack. Now, you also mentioned before we started recording this, Michael Meacher. He was about to testify in perfectly good health, and right before he testified, and he was a high-ranking official. You said he worked for the Blair administration as well as two other high-ranking UK.
Well, yeah, I mean, he'd been a Minister of the Environment under Tony Blair. He'd also served in the Callaghan government and the Wilson government, even in the late 1970s. So he was a member of Parliament and a cabinet minister. He was a member of the Privy Council. So the Privy Council is basically the Queen's little cosy club where everyone that's ever been a government minister or, I think it's not just cabinet ministers, it's government ministers too, who are kind of friendly with them. Well, no, I mean, just to correct you slightly, he wasn't due to testify, but what he had done is he'd spoken to some of the campaigners I work with from the Reinvestigate 9/11 campaign here in Britain to put on a showing of loose change in the House of Commons. Yes. So that was what was being planned. Now this is a little while ago, but I spoke when Michael Meacher died. I spoke to one of those people who was involved in that, who explained to me, well, hey, actually what happened was we were due to show loose change in the Houses of Parliament, and Michael had got threats about it. So he just took an executive decision. He said, look, because there's been this threat against us and a threat to disrupt it, threats of violence, then I think it's probably better if we just cancel it and maybe do it at another date. Well, of course, poor old Michael's now dead, and so he can't arrange another date. And I mean, he's one of those people. I think if you go on to Start Page or another decent search engine somewhere, you can find all sorts about Michael, particularly on YouTube and other video channels. being actually very, very articulate about what the US is really up to, being very clear that great love for the American people, but a great dislike for the military-industrial complex, which is sort of swallowing up the executive power in America. And the other thing with Michael is he also got the first debate in the House of Commons ever about the Bilderberg conference. This is back in 2013 when Bilderberg came to Watford here in Britain. David Cameron attended, and various other, I can't remember exactly who. I know George Osborne was there, and other luminaries from the British government, mostly the Tories that seemed to be desperate to go. And then he actually even came down to Watford and gave a speech to the 3,000 or so people that had turned out to protest. Now, a lot of people, I've done loads of work on the Bilderbergs over the years. In fact, it was when I first put up I was the first person to actually put up full attendee lists on the 1996 conference, I think, and the 1997 conference online. Maybe 95 too, that I got from Reuters, because I had access to the Reuters database for a few weeks, and I pulled out these Bilderberg lists with these amazing press releases when it says not for publication. I've never ever come across a press release which is not for publication. This is the craziness of the Bilderbergs. And so it was great for me to see that we actually had to, in the UK, the policing, by the way, was brilliant. The police were really good. Hertfordshire Police, it was, that policed the demonstration outside that Bilderberg. But they were saying quietly and privately to us, well, actually, maybe we should be in there arresting them, And this is an inspector, police inspector saying that. And there were more people that had to be turned away from that demonstration because there was people came from all over the world. Loads of Brits came to the demo, and it was effectively what they call a kind of fringe festival. So there were loads of talks going on, performance, all this sort of stuff. It was a beautiful event, and we turned away more people than had ever been to a Bilderberg protest again. So I would say Britain is really the heart of the resistance of this kind of totalitarian corporate empire that Bilderberg represents.
Alex Jones did actually infiltrated. I don't want to say he was actually part of the Bilderberg conference, but he was close enough where he was able to film some of their ceremony. I guess he wasn't close enough to capture any of their audio, but some of the who's who of the world was on that guest list. I believe Princess from Holland, just a little bit of everybody, people who have influence over the world that can make decisions for the good or the worse of mankind. And I believe, and so many other people are starting to believe, that these people are there to make decisions from everything from the environment to geopolitics to the economy worldwide, to everything, and to essentially control it.
Well,
is that where
right? Well, they are, but one of the things that people quite often miss is that these are really the NATO countries that it represents. So the main core NATO countries is where the participants to the Bilderberg come along. I look upon it as a kind of Bond villains convention every year, where all the crooks get together. And that's why they have to have such high security. Almost, it does feel a little bit sometimes like, you're watching a movie, seeing all these so-called high-ups arrive. But, they're actually just like us, but that they're very guarded about what they do with their wealth. They're greedy. They've got too much wealth. They've got far too much wealth. They want more wealth. They want to use their wealth to shut down any kind of the soul of humanity, really, looking at, shutting down democratic parliaments, shutting down the press, the media. They want to buy it all up. Wherever they see anything that opposes them, even if it's quite reasonable, they just want to close it down, shut it down one way or another so that they can increase their influence. So that's effectively what they are. The other thing that people often forget is the name Bilderberg. What's the significance of it? Where does it come from? And it comes actually from this little town in Holland, the Bilderberg
hotel, right?
The Bilderberg Hotel, yeah. But the place where that Bilderberg Hotel is very important, very important. And very few people understand the link between that and the Second World War and the Nazis, because it's the town where that Bilderberg Hotel is called Oosterbeek. It's a sort of suburb just outside the town of Arnhem, and there was a massive battle for the liberation of Holland that took place in World War II there. And the same location where that hotel is, the first meeting, which took place 10 years after the battle in 1954, was called, in that battle, was called the Witch's Cauldron. It was called the Witch's Cauldron because the British 1st Airborne Division was surrounded by loads of crack German troops with flamethrowers, with tanks, with heavy weapons, Nebelwerfers, these rocket launchers that the Nazi troops had, with all sorts of horrendous equipment. Of course, they're only airborne troops; they're very lightly armed, and it was an absolute massacre. So I think, in a way, the Bilderberg Conference is a kind of in-joke for that massacre that took place, and a celebration in a perverse way of the victory over the Americans and the British as part of Operation Market Garden, which of course is celebrated in the amazing, wonderful film called A Bridge Too Far. And people don't understand that the chairman of the Bilderbergs, the Lord Carrington and also Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands were both at that battle. They took part in the battle at Arnhem. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, he was involved as a liaison officer with the British Army, so he was a Dutch liaison officer, even though he was a former SS officer. He was chairing the Bilderberg meetings right from their start, the beginning in 1950s, right way to till 1975. It was him that sent in a so-called spy. The guy's code name was King Kong. His real name's Christian Lindemans, and he was sent in a few days before the battle to liaise with the Dutch resistance. And instead of liaising with the Dutch resistance, he went straight to the Abwehr. He was actually a Nazi agent. So Bernhard, who was supposed to be supporting the Brits and his own countrymen, actually betrayed his country, betrayed us, and reverted to type as the former SS officer that he was, so he was involved. Also, Carrington was in the 30 Corps and in the Grenadier Guards, sitting in a tank, and it was him amongst his tank troops that, even though they had a clear road to Arnhem, which had been opened up when the bridge failed to explode at Nijmegen, which is portrayed by Robert Redford in the film brilliantly, where Redford is one of these airborne American 82nd Airborne Division troops. He goes up to the guy in the tank, who is Carrington in real life, and he says, "What are you doing? Get on down the road. Your guys are dying in Arnhem." And he says, "Oh, well, I've been told to stay here. My orders are to stay." Well, that was actually the reality, and I spoke to Moffat Burris, who was in the 82nd at Arnhem, at the Nijmegen Bridge, and Moffat told me that he pointed his Tommy gun to Carrington's head and said, "Get down that blankety-blank road now before I blow your blankety-blank head off," because literally they had taken this bridge at Nijmegen, and there was just about 14 miles to go where there were no Germans at all, where they could go and complete the operation. But Carrington just sat there twiddling his thumbs, and he said that Carrington actually had to go and get into his tank and lock down the hatch so that the American airborne troops couldn't get at him. So it certainly looks as if there was some sort of sabotage of that operation going on there, and that this is the little in-joke that the Bilderbergs like to celebrate every time they use the word, because that was the hotel in the middle of the Witch's Cauldron in September 1944, where it all began.
With regards to the members of the Bilderberg, billionaires across the world, I've never understood, if you have 10 billion pounds, that's an enormous sum of money. What is it that you need that requires you to get 11 billion pounds that you can't already buy with 10?
Yeah, look, you can ask the same thing about land, can't you? We've got these massive landowners like the Duke of Westminster, the Duke of Buccleuch, both, by the way, who happen to be rather, or at least their ancestors anyway, very pro-Nazi. They've got land holdings of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands actually of acres, hundreds of thousands of acres here in Britain, large swathes of Scotland, almost entire counties. And people make the comment, which makes me laugh too, well, they've got whole forests that they've never even seen, but which they own. And how can you be in that situation where you've got so much land that much of it you've never even seen it? You don't know what it is even. You're just leasing it out like a feudal lord to somebody else. Well, it goes to show, doesn't it? We are actually living in this kind of economic feudalism, and actually in parallel with a feudalism which goes right back to the Norman invasion. A lot of it, neighbours to me here in Bristol, for example, there's Lord Waldegrave, just south of here. These land holdings, many of these dukes and earls have had these land holdings for 700 years or more.
The hunger for this power and greed seems to never end, and like I said, it's wiping out the middle class. It boggles my mind when I think about it. Again, going back to that question, what can't you buy with £10 billion that you need £11 billion?
Yeah, but it's not about that. It's about power, isn't it?
Power, exactly.
These people just want more and more power. It's greed. They're drunk, aren't they? I mean, it makes me almost think of the Book of Revelation, where it talks about Babylon the Great being drunk. This is interesting, isn't it? That's exactly what they are. They've had too much of this drug, which is called wealth, and I just think that their fear of death drives them to have more and more while they're still alive, and in a way they haven't come to terms with death, have they? They're saying, well, they're trying to grab as much as they can while they're still alive. I don't know what you make of that, but that seems to be part of the psychological motivation for just grabbing more and more and more while you're still alive. If you don't believe that you're going to, anything happens after you die, then maybe you just feel like, well, what the hell, I'll just try and grab as much as I can while I'm still here. Not very spiritual an approach, but I think that's what's going on in many of these people's minds.
I'm glad you mentioned they have this quench and hunger for power and greed, because that's what it comes down to. When you have all the money in the world and you have land, the last thing you need or you want is control of the people. Tony Gosling, it has been a true honor to speak to you. We definitely must do this again. I want to ask you if there's any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience, and also if there's anything, any websites or where people can find you if they want to contact you or write to you or anything like that.
Well, I suppose final thoughts are around the idea of, the legends of William Tell, Robin Hood. I mean, everybody's got their own favourite, haven't they? But that, to me, is the spirit of the age at the moment, where we've got a lot of particularly young people who are really up for, hang on, they've got their heads around this. It's going to be impossible to pull the wool over their eyes. And if you want to try and enslave them by whatever means, whether it be microchipping people, I mean, Catherine Albrecht's done some brilliant work on that. And effectively, we're already getting to the stage with our bank cards that there's a little microchip we need for everything. The contactless payment is a very, very small step to put that as an implantable microchip in a human being. We're getting towards this mark of the beast stage. And I think there's going to be a bit of a fight over that. I don't think that the people that want to do that are going to have it all their own way. So a lot of positivity around, actually. I feel, certainly here in Bristol, a lot of consciousness and a lot of feeling, well, you're not going to pull the wool over our eyes. But if you want to follow some of the work I do a weekly politics program on the radio here, which is live here from 5 till 7 p.m. for people driving home in Bristol on a Friday evening, where we do
GMT.
That's right.
GMT.
That's right. Where we do chat with local politicians, MPs, MEPs, etc. And then we go into some more investigative stuff week by week. We're really trying to get into the some of the stuff that the mainstream media just isn't bothering with, or is deliberately avoiding increasingly because it's too embarrassing to the government or too embarrassing to powerful people. And that's online at thisweek.org.uk. You can also find my work on the Bilderbergers at bilderberg.org. And also there's a very lively forum where we discuss loads of this, and there's a massive archive on all sorts of different subjects related to 9/11 and 7/7, and I've done a lot of work on the 7/7 London bombings as well, which is quite clearly, to me anyway, another false flag, where the 4 alleged bombers of the 7/7 may at some point in the future be added to the victim list rather than the perpetrator list. and you'll find that at 911forum.org.uk.
Again, everybody, thank you, Tony Gosling, and everybody out there listening. This is a true investigative journalist. Stay tuned for more information from him. Pay attention to his program, his website, and, of course, check out my website, drjradiolive.com, drjradiolive.com, as well as the YouTube channel where all the shows get archived. It's the same name, DRJ Radio Live, Dr. J Radio Live.
I love doing this, Dr. J. I love doing this because this is the real special relationship across the Atlantic, isn't it?
It's sure.